I'm Rob Bertini, and on behalf of myself and Jennifer from the Oregon Department of Transportation, who will be talking today about modeling rail capacity in the I-5 trade corridor. Gentlemen, thank you.
All right, thanks. We said we had the opportunity to introduce ourselves. I would actually like to introduce Ed Immel. I first met Ed about 20 years ago when he worked for the PUC. Some of you, when you were kids, probably got to go tour the Freedom Train. This is Mr. Freedom Train, organizer.
And Mark used to be my boss.
Yeah, Ed's is a rail planner with the Oregon Rail Program. And do you want to say anything about yourself?
Well, I would just get an opportunity to say I'm a Portland State graduate who actually found gainful employment. So there's hope out there. I remember when I first came here, there were still desks that said Vanport Center on them, so things have changed greatly. In fact, when I was there was very little in the planning program. Was pretty sparse. But I got to say, background in geography did help me in my going to work originally from Multnomah County and then for the state. Since then, I've been working as a planner, but I do a lot more than just plan. We also construct. The rail division is relatively small. We have 18 people, and so we don't have a huge support staff. We got to kind of do it yourself. And I know everything railroad from doing planning to running a locomotive. So this has really been interesting. I think if anything, it's one of those jobs that's a fun job. And I can say that even though I'm going to retire in a couple of months, it's been fun almost every single day. Mark?
And I'm Mark Ford. I am a senior project manager with HDR Engineering. Prior to that, I spent about 25 years with the Oregon Department of Transportation. My background is have a master's degree in economics and have spent most of my career doing planning and finance around transportation. And it's really interesting to see what's going on the screen. I hope the presentation goes. I get to do, in my career, I've gotten to do a lot of different things. And so, I don't know, I hear that some of you are out of the engineering side, civil engineering, and some of you are on the urban studies side. And it reminds me that they used to tell me that the planners, the difference between the planners and the engineers is the planners knew less and less about more and more until they knew nothing about everything. Whereas the engineers knew more and more about less and less until they knew everything about nothing. Well, I know a little about a whole bunch of things, which is why Ed's with me today, because he was our client on this particular study that I'm going to show you. And I was actually not the modeler, but I was the project manager. So I'm going to talk with you a little bit about this, and then there's a few points at which Ed's really the right person to fill you in on what's happening here. So I hope that we have fun with this and hope you learn some things. By the way, raise your hand and ask questions anytime, because some of this stuff, if you're like me, the first time I saw it, you won't have seen anything like it before, so speak up. I can't quite. Anyway. If I don't.
That's why I use overheads. I don't trust this thing.
Okay.
Well, the one time I used overheads, and within the first 5 seconds, the bulb blew out. The overhead was
Well, I'm gonna start my discussion anyway, because the first thing I was going to show you was the picture that's behind the picture you see there. That photograph actually came from Port of Portland archives, but one of the things about Portland, it is truly a significant regional transportation hub. And in a minute you'll see more of that photo, but we have a water level passage past the Cascade Mountains to Idaho through the Snake River. We have 2 transcontinental railroads that run up through that Columbia Gorge, Interstate Highway. And of course we have an interstate highway that runs north-south, which I'll point to in a moment on that, but you can't see because it's behind that little brown thing. And then you see the ocean port facilities down here with Terminal 6, the Port of Vancouver facilities across the river. So a very significant transportation center. And rail plays a very significant role in that. Great deal, if you track grain movements, you would notice that of all the grain that comes off the West Coast, a huge percentage of it comes through the Columbia River. Much of it comes down by barge. Much of it, I believe even more, comes down by train. That goes back and forth, but train carries a huge amount of that. In addition, north-south, you'll see lumber, industrial movement, and you'll see a great deal of intermodal, that is containers coming from the Port of Seattle, Tacoma, and Portland that will come through this terminal area headed east on the Burlington Northern and Union Pacific lines.
Mark, you might want to be interested. On a statewide basis, we move about 65 million tons of freight, either originate, terminate, or pass through Oregon. So that doesn't mean a lot to most people because the rail system usually isn't, you don't really see it. But it's equivalent of about 1.5 million trucks. That exceeds the total amount of trucks that cross the Oregon-California border just south of Ashland. And of that 65 million or 1.5 million trucks, 75 to 80% originate, terminate, or pass through Multnomah County. That does not include the 80-some, about 40-some million tons that operates on the north bank of the Columbia River and does not enter Multnomah County. So between the two, we may be talking close to 100 million tons of freight are in this picture. You can't see it, but in 1 year will pass through pretty much what you see in here. So because the system is kind of submerged, you don't really get the impact of all of the movements that are out there. But just think of 1.5 million trucks, and that'll give you an idea.
Anyway, if you were, that's all. It's about ready to go. We're almost there. All right, I can do the rest of the picture. I love this picture. If, as I was talking about, you see Interstate 5 bridge here. Oh, that was good. All right. Imagine that you see the Interstate 5 bridge. And right next to it. Oh, okay. Yeah. Here, I can tell you all my tale of woe about efficiency in state government. I don't know. Can the class see this? Here's the report that was produced as a result of this study and what we'll be talking about today. We had a beautiful color cover that we did for this because we were really impressed with this client. And but when it got to the printer's office, we were told that the state of Oregon does not print things in color, so we had to redo it in black and white. So, but I believe copies of this report are actually online. If you go to the ODOT website through the rail division, you can find copies of this report. And I'll put it down here for the benefit.
Actually, it's full of color things that you cannot duplicate in black and white.
Right.
It is color on our webpage. You can find it on the ODOT Rail Division's webpage.
Interesting. Yeah.
You guys say your names.
Okay.
Where you work against us, you guys at that time.
Mark Ford, HDR Engineering.
And Ed, M-I-M-M-E-L, at ODOT Rail Division.
Interesting. Well, let's see.
You should have brought those overheads.
Actually, yeah, I should.
We'll have you up in just a second.
Okay.
All it did was
Yeah, got a question?
When you gave statistics for how much weight you guys pull through Oregon, is that including passengers or is that just?
The weight figure you gave for freight.
No, it's only freight. It's only freight, yes. And that's the weight of it. That's I should point out that's the weight of the cargo.
It's not the,
That's the weight of the cargo, not the weight of the vehicle that carries it. And so that's why that you'll see some other numbers that may show the total weight of the train, which is different, the same way as an 80,000-pound truck is probably only carrying 55,000 pounds worth of goods. So you've got to kind of watch that number, what it means. Look for the asterisk.
what?
Did you have a PowerPoint?
Yeah, there's a CD in the system.
We have one reminder for the people in the audience. When you ask a question, you need to use the microphone in front of you so that the webcast records it. People out in Wetland can hear your question. So you need to keep holding down on the little button that says touch. Keep the red light on when you ask your question, and then they'll respond. They have microphones.
Just a big one.
All right.
That one?
Yeah, when you talk about freight and how much moves by different modes, just a kind of a rule of thumb that you can use for planning is a semi-truck holds about 25 tons. A rail car typical rail car holds about 100 tons. So about roughly 4 truckloads to a rail car. So when you get a unit train of grain, if you had a 90 car unit train of grain, you can then figure there were 360 trucks that was equivalent to. And then if you take about 10 unit trains, that's about a shipload of going in and out of the harbor there. So that rough idea of the size of this. Okay, now you can see the I-5 bridge. And you can see the Burlington Northern Rail Bridge, which when you're driving north on I-5, if you look to your left, out to the west, you'll see that bridge. This has become it's really a focal point of what we're talking about today. So what we will be the outline of the discussion, we'll talk about the I-5 capacity study background. I'll show you a little bit about the modeling of rail capacity and what we did with this, and then talk about the findings of the study. And this is the rail capacity study. I'll let Ed talk about this.
Yeah, over the years, we've modeled both Portland to Eugene, and we've modeled Portland to Seattle as far as the passengers program goes, and we have to include freight in there. But we have never modeled the whole Portland rail network as a unit. We've modeled Burlington Northern, we've modeled UP, but because one runs on the other in other places, we've never looked at the interrelationship between the two. What happens on one railroad is in fact impacted what goes on the other railroad. So what we wanted to see is let's take a neutral view of the Portland area. Let's not look at whether the locomotives are green or whether the locomotives are yellow. We're going to look at it as a rail movement, like a big eye in the sky. And so we wanted to look at what was going on in the rail network to find out if it was inefficient, if we were having problems like rush hour at the Columbia River Bridge every week. Was that going on? We wanted to know that. And so we asked HDR Engineering, and along with what's called Washington Group, which actually had the model, in order to find out what were the efficiencies. Was it running well, or did we have a whole lot of problems? We had some intuitive intuitive ideas that we had some problems out there.
But it was interesting as we go ahead. This was the Technical Advisory Committee. This was actually significant. It is sometimes very difficult to get the railroads in the metropolitan areas and the state DOTs to sit down together. But this committee actually met more times than we originally intended, and it included all 3 of the railroads, BN, UP, Amtrak, as well as the state DOTs and the regional governments and the major cities. Just a rough outline of the rail system. 2 transcontinental railroads, Union Pacific, Burlington Northern. Amtrak service comes through the area. And then several switching and short line railroads. These don't carry traffic cross country, but they're the ones that serve the yards that you'll be seeing, many of the yards that you'll be seeing later. Current situation, just some factors in terms of railroads that are significant. First, the rail lines are owned by private railroads. So one of the things that people don't sometimes realize is that Amtrak's actually leasing the lines over which they're operating. They don't own those lines, Burlington Northern and Union Pacific. And in fact, in this case, that bridge is the Burlington Northern Bridge, but Union Pacific Railroad has rights to use it. So they both use the same rail bridge. Portland, Vancouver, as Ed was talking about, has a high concentration of the freight traffic and the rail traffic. The region has 4 major rail yards, and of course the rail system serves the area's heavy industries. Critical to deep water ports. One of the issues that comes out of this is what expansion ability does the Port of Portland have if they cannot get more rail service into their terminals? And then we talk about the major bottleneck between Union Station. I'll talk about that later. Now, in the midst of this, so you've got this freight rail network running all over the place. You've got Amtrak that runs through the middle of this, and we'll talk about some of the issues that creates. The main one being that the passenger service must have the agreement of the freight railroads to operate. The existing Amtrak, by the way, the Coast Starlight, is grandfathered in because it existed before, when Amtrak was first formed. But the Cascade runs that you see now, they have to have agreements between the states and the railroads. Here's what we're roughly talking about. The green lines are the Burlington Northern system. Starting down here, you see Union Station running up along the river, across the bridge that you saw in that picture, to Vancouver Yard, and then headed north up to Tacoma, Seattle. This is the main line. There's also what's called, well, this is the other main line, what's called the Fall Bridge subdivision as we talk about it heading up the Columbia Gorge. Most of the red is the Union Pacific, the Kenton line that we'll talk about, and the Graham line. This Graham line, if any of you remember the old Southern Pacific, that was the SP line originally. This point, when we started this study, one of the things that was on our mind was there a new bridge needed, a new rail bridge? Was that where the capacity problem was? And at first glance, actually, there's some credence to that, in that at the time we first started looking at this, about 2000, there were 63 freight trains, 10 Amtrak trains a day over that, projected to grow to 90 freight and 13 trains a day. Yeah.
I had a question on those projections. Is that based on a dredging of the Columbia, or as it is now?
That's as it is now. The dredging won't have any effect, shouldn't have any effect on those particular figures.
Okay, and it wouldn't affect?
Because that's the north-south rail movement, so
Okay.
It shouldn't affect that. Where some of the capacity constraints we knew about when we started the study, there are junctions and industrial leads. The significance of this is, you'll see some points of freight interference in a moment. But usually you like to get the switching trains that are delivering the products to the plants off the main line. Well, these corridors are very narrow. There's no place to do that, so they're switching right on the main line. You've got movable bridge spans. We can understand that one. When the bridge opens, the train stops. And we've got yards and terminals. That are, of course, they're an integral part of the rail system, but again, this is a narrow corridor, so they're a point of issue there. Key study question, what's the capacity of the system? And is the capacity sufficient to accommodate present and future freight needs? Is there sufficient capacity to support the port? And is there capacity to support expanded passenger rail? And so that's what we're looking at.
I should point out that we knew there wasn't to start out. I mean,
Oh, that's a surprise.
and we would just want to know, well, how bad really was it? I mean, we knew that the answer to all of those was no, but you have to have people, you've got to have a study to prove that your feeling is correct.
But what you will see, though, is that the gut feel on what improvements are needed to ensure capacity now in the future, that came out a little bit. Ed might have predicted this. I didn't predict how it was going to come out. This is okay. The simulation model. Ed, why don't you talk about the model a little bit?
I should point out that if anybody is used to modeling, and basically transportation modeling used on highways where we look at traffic counts and we have peak hour flows and all those other things, is that railroads are different in the fact that there's an eye in the sky. There's a guy there in Fort Worth, in Burlington Northern, or in Omaha for the Union Pacific, directing where the trains are going to go. And the peak hours don't occur at 8 in the morning or at 5 in the afternoon. We found one occurs at 3 in the morning. So there is some control over that. There's an interreaction of what goes on in Seattle versus what goes on in Portland, and how they all funnel down through here. Now you can get, and Mark will show you a very simple one, what you can look at is you can buy a game where you can play train dispatcher. That's all very simple because you only got 8 trains. We got 80 trains. Plus, what happened in the years is that the modeling has become more sophisticated, and some models do a better job of one part of it, and other models do a better job of the other one. To give you an idea, this is not something you go down to Blockbuster Video and buy. It's not a game. It's about $150,000 piece of software. And as Mark may say later, every time we wanted to run a reiteration, it was a $15,000 hit. So this is very sophisticated modeling. As you go into it, we'll try to. I think you have to appreciate it once you're in it, that how sophisticated this model really is, and what it does, and what it, in some cases, what it can't do. But the model we used was used both by the Union Pacific and the Burlington Northern. So we had a common platform so we could agree upon it, not one guy saying, well, my model is different than your model, so your results are skewed. The person that we had, or the two people that we had running the model, had in fact contracted the Union Pacific and Burlington Northern to do modeling that they could not do, did not have the time to do. So we had a model that all the railroads agreed that this was the one that they could live with, and also the people doing it, they had faith in whatever the people did. It wasn't like coming an outsider to come in and say, this is what you should do. They had used the results before from the two people that we employed, and so it gave it a level of credence. In fact, we had very little, hardly any arguments between the two railroads as to what the inputs were and the outputs were. The other thing we have to appreciate that the railroads don't like to bare their souls over how trains move and what kind of commodities they move. And if you notice on the advisory committee that was there was no general public involved, because the railroads were sharing with us confidential, proprietary market data. And all of us that were in there kind of said, we can't talk about the detail. We can talk about the summaries, but we're not going to talk about the details. So I think that was important. And then, as we'll go into this thing, you will see how we modeled that this was a model of the whole region. And we had just followed up, this study had just followed up with one they had done in Chicago. And Chicago has 7 railroads, and we'll see some of the comparison. So this, in some ways, was relatively simple, but Chicago spent a lot of money to do theirs, so we got kind of a fallout of what do you do when you lay one system on top of another system.
One of the very significant things Ed mentioned is, in order to run this model, you have to have actual dispatch data from the trains that came into the system on an area that you're going to simulate. So we actually had to contract with the railroads that the data would be confidential to us, and we wouldn't tell those guys what was in the data. And this is all because the railroads are very heavily competing with each other, and they don't want people to know, what's in those trains. They don't want their competition to know. So the model simulates actual operating decisions, shows how the trains are. Well, you'll see all this stuff as we move ahead. This is the system. You're used to seeing highway maps of Portland. This is a rail map of Portland that's a little bit more detailed than what we had before. But here's the bridge that we're talking about. Come down the BNSF main line to Union Station here. This is the Union Pacific line, comes under the Peninsula Tunnel there. You'll see a thing called the Peninsula Junction, and you'll see something called the, what do we call this, North Portland Junction. And these will play heavily into the process. Now, here's what it looks like in the simulation model. Here's the bridge. Here's Union Station, down, well, right in there somewhere. Then the BNSF main line, Vancouver Yard, which which ends up having a huge impact here. It's interesting, when you look at some of these things on a map, you don't realize what's happening up here that's affecting down here. And then here, the Kenton line that we talked about, and the Graham line, and then the Union Pacific Main line going south toward Canby.
We also modeled as far north as Tacoma.
Yeah.
Because the data was available, and it was going to cost us a lot of money
Oh.
to truncate it at someplace like
Yeah.
Longview. That's why.
And we
that's why it's in there.
and we modeled out east, salmon, or anyway, well past Troutdale to the east. There's just some basic capacity issues, and Ed saw my first time I did this and hates it, but you guys will appreciate this. Trains don't work like cars. When they come up to each other, they can't just pass. So that's what obviously sidings are for. We all get that, but different speeds create interesting problems too. There's a train moving along, comes up behind it. What are you going to do? Well, sidings are useful for that too. Length of train creates a special problem. One, when they're going through the switch, they take a lot of time to go through the switch, but the other, if there's not room on the siding, we got yet another problem. Double tracks often solve the problem. By the way, a cool thing about trains is, unlike roads where you always got to stay on the right side, or if you're in Japan on the left side, trains can switch back and forth, because remember that dispatcher that's there in Omaha and the one in Fort Worth that says, hey, I got to move this train around that other train, I'll just move it over to the other track. And so you can actually do that.
It's quite, if you go to Seattle on a train, as many times you'll be pacing a train that's going in the same direction as you are. And then you'll slow down and you'll actually go ahead of it and pull in. So don't worry, it's all under control. Everybody knows what's going on there.
The Y, this is where your junctions are, and schematically how it works. Here's a double Y. You've got double tracks coming in, and
That's Vancouver.
this is Vancouver. You'll see a little bit better diagram in a minute of Vancouver, but you can see that this gives you a lot of flexibility in a lot of situations. But if somebody wants to make a left turn, it does the same thing as it does on highways, with the exception that that train may take 7 or 8 or 15 minutes to make that turn. So these are all issues. The other thing I want to talk a little bit about blocking. This has to do with train safety. When a train enters an area of track, and with that big model you saw these little breaks, those are blocks. So when a train enters that, the whole block goes red. No other train is allowed to enter it. And this is for safety reasons, obviously. Well, we've got a train coming down here, so he just turned this block red. Okay, well, there's still lots of capacity. But here comes another train. Okay, it just turned that block red. And now this train turns on to the other line, and now he's got several lines blocked red. Well, that took 2 trains to block all those lines that way. This way, we can use one train, and he can block all of them by himself by making a left turn. So this is some of the capacity issues. Let's take a look at this specific point. Here's a diagram of Fallbridge. Remember I said that goes up the gorge, up to Tacoma, the Willamette Slough, Hayden Island. This is the problem that just occurs constantly there. This is the Union Pacific Main Line. So when trains come down across here and want to go onto the main line, they block the track. That train can be 8,000 feet and take 7 or 8 minutes to go through that switch.
One day we were timing it, and it took, by the time the signals went red, because they go in advance, that it took 14 minutes for a train to clear from the time it went in there. Now there's 20-some trains a day making this maneuver. You can see how much time it's taking up in this small piece of track, and we're looking at the growth rate to be about 2.5% per year. So when you see that number right now, it's 20, and not too many years it's going to be 30, all making this one maneuver.
Now, oh, go ahead.
Just a dumb question, but when I was in Belgium, they had flyovers. Oh, sorry. When I was in Belgium, they had flyovers for trains. Have they thought of doing that same thing here?
Very expensive.
But you're getting to one of our conclusions.
Yes, one of our conclusions. You read
That's
the
a
last page.
good question.
Yeah, question.
Yeah.
You were discussing the problem with how much time it takes up, and that kind of raises a question of who gets priority. In your eyes, do cars and traffic get priority, or do we want to ship those trains through, and do they get priority?
Oh, Well,
That's an interesting
it's
question.
an interesting legal question as well as a philosophical one.
That North Portland Junction is where the Union Pacific comes on to the Burlington Northern Main Line and goes all the way to Tacoma. That's controlled by the Burlington Northern dispatcher. Now, if the Burlington Northern dispatcher has a Burlington Northern train coming out of Portland, coming across the Willamette River, and he wants to go through that same junction, the Union Pacific will always say that the Burlington Northern is stabbing their train and won't let them get out on the main line. Although the dispatchers will, oh no, we treat everything equal, we don't care what color the train is. The modeling that we did exactly that. There was no differentiation. It made the best decision and took out all the emotional factors to whether that was my company's train or their train. Because there's other places where the Union Pacific has a Burlington Northern going over it, so there's kind of trading things, and so they'll always say down there, well, you give priority to your train. So, for the most part, I think it's fairly balanced, and it really happens. What goes on, and you got one railroad dispatcher who's got somebody screaming at him to get this train out of there, and he's got another train coming at him, and so he's probably going to go out and take care of the guy who's screaming at him rather than the guy who's meeting the monthly meeting and complain.
Anyway, well, good questions. Now, one of the early thoughts was, well, gee, wouldn't a third rail across this bridge help? Well, it would create a little bit more capacity, but obviously that left turn does the same thing it used to do. Now, actually, it could be made from the middle track, so you could get a little bit more capacity. But the key problems were here and up here, as you'll see in a minute, not on the bridge itself.
When we did the highway modeling, everybody thought, well, we need to widen the interstate highway bridge to 20 lanes in each direction. But what happens when you get to the Coliseum? It all goes down to 4 lanes, or Lombard Street. So some of the same principles occur here as they did elsewhere. Even though you take care of one little piece of it, you shove the problem off. And we wanted to know what were those other problems. Okay.
Yeah. So here's the capacity principles that are built into the model. Safety first, that has to do with blocking and not doing. Trains are big and heavy and do a lot of damage if they hit anything. Dispatcher rules that dispatcher gets to decide. All trains are not equal. Passenger trains have a priority over freight trains. So that's one of the reasons that freight railroads are obviously concerned whenever they approve new passenger service, because that new passenger service, once it's on the line, it's going to take priority over the freight trains.
Should also point out that within freight,
Well,
we have what, 9 different classifications. Number 9 is an Amtrak train, and you go down, and as you get down to number 1, are you still out there somewhere? And so as they go in there, even within the dispatching model, they'll take a number 8 train that has priority a number 4 train. But sometimes the dispatcher will take a number 2 train, and advance it over a number 4 train for some reasons. And so there's this pecking order that goes on the rail that also goes passenger. And so really interesting is when you take an Amtrak passenger train, which has the highest priority, and an intermodal like UPS, United Parcel Service train, which has about the same priority, except the Amtrak train's paying like $8 a mile, and UPS is earning them like $150 per mile. So you can see the decisions that they're wrestling with, the economics. Who cares about the guy drinking coffee? I got the package it's got to go through.
Anyway, good. And obviously, as Ed said, the railroads are operating trying to maximize their capacity. Things that mess up. Oh, go ahead.
I was just wondering, do you know about the numbers, if the passenger trains were increasing and the freight trains were decreasing?
Oh, actually, yeah, currently there are, as we just talked about, roughly 65 freight trains a day cross in that one point, and 10 passenger trains. To add more passenger trains requires agreements with the railroads, and as I recall, there is an agreement out there that when they finish a particular project at the Vancouver Yard, then they can add another train. So passenger trains are increasing very slowly. Freight trains tend to go up and down with the economy. When the economy is booming, you see a lot more trains. Well, it's yeah. So yeah, that's how the growth of them looks now. Speed and length of trains makes a difference. One thing is interesting with trains: a fast train coming through can actually sometimes jam up the system too, because remember those blocks? Well, you got to turn the block red so that it's already, ready to be blocked off when that train gets to it. So that means if the train's going too fast for the system, they're having to push trains out of the way off onto sidings. So speed, and if it's going too slow, obviously creates a problem. Differing priorities that we just talked about creates issues in the system. Many types of facilities in the same area, like we talked about, if you're trying to run switchers and they got to go out onto the main line. So we said, adding capacity, how do you do that? Sometimes you can change operating practices. That's kind of similar to roads. Sometimes you can change the street light phases and you can get some mileage out of it. And then, but you may have to invest in track and signals as well. So let's come back to this simulation. This is the same picture you just saw. And here's what it looks like when we load a bunch of trains on it. Now, those trains, the colors don't mean a lot to you, and the letters in front of you can see them. If there's a B in front, that just means that that won't mean anything except the first letter. If it's a B, means Burlington Northern, or a U means Union Pacific. And the other thing that's interesting is if it has an arrowhead that's white, that means that train's being delayed. So here's a train with a white arrowhead, and because you have a hard time seeing it, let's blow it up. Here's a Union Pacific train trying to leave Vancouver Yard, and it's delayed. And why is it delayed? Well, because you got this other train, which is a Union Pacific train, coming through, clogging up Peninsula Junction and the North Portland Junction, and that's where this train wants to go. So let's go back.
I should point out also, to go back to that, what compounds things even worse is that it says it's U-Z. Z is the highest priority train that the Union Pacific has. That's United Parcel Service stuff. People lose their jobs on the railroad for delaying that. So you've got a U train that's delaying an I, which is a manifest train, which has got boxcars and everything else on it. So this is where you see priorities that are bumping into each other.
You started I don't know what sequence you went in, but do you use any criteria for starting your study in a certain area? I see you started at the North Portland Junction and you went up above the Columbia Slough in the river. Is it any order in which you start the study on the model, or did you just pick that?
Well, yes, there is. What the area that you're trying to model when you're doing railroads, you've got to look at an area far enough beyond that the dispatching decisions that are made beyond that area that are going to affect you downstream in time are taken into account. So that's why, for instance, we went up to Tacoma. Any dispatching decision south of Tacoma on the Burlington Northern line is going to affect the traffic in this area around Portland. And likewise, actually, the modeler told us, the guy that was running this model, but we didn't have adequate data, would like to have gone down to Eugene on the Union Pacific. So yeah, and the results of this don't necessarily concentrate on what's going up above Tacoma, but by putting it into the model, you can assure more accurate results in the area that you're actually studying.
It's almost like a snowstorm at O'Hare. Why a snowstorm there, until you don't have a plane out of San Jose. There is a ripple effect through the whole system. Yeah.
So that's how that decision was made. Yeah. So here we've got this train the Z train being delayed. You've got a train coming up behind it that you'll see something in a minute, and you've got a train down there to keep an eye on. So this is like 3:30 in the morning. Now, 45 minutes later, this train, which train was, anyway, this train now is coming up through the switch, and they've still delayed this Z train. And meanwhile, there's another train backed up behind it. Can't get through. Now we're an hour and a half later, a Burlington Northern train coming off the Fallbridge subdivision now crossed that track and still kept this train in the yard.
Guess who controls that switch? It's the Burlington Northern.
Now, this model was completely neutral. So I'm sure Burlington Northern looks at it and says, see, I told you we weren't doing that on purpose. Now, meanwhile, you've got other trains delayed through the system. Okay, now you thought, oh, wait, this I think is a repeat. Now you've got one that if I were the UP dispatcher, I would be really, really ticked. because here's a switcher train running out on the main line above it. Now, I know why they're doing that. That's because they were trying to bring another train down here out of the Port of Portland that had to cross that line anyway. So they still, even if they would have moved him out, he would have stopped on the bridge. And this is about 3 hours later. So here we are 3.5 hours later. Finally, that train gets to move. And meanwhile, you can see a couple of 3 more trains backed up in the system there. So this is what the model does for 96 consecutive hours, and then tallies up all the results to see what happened.
What's called kind of a typical day. It's composed of 96 hours, so we catch anomalies that might occur. There may be some trains that run some days and not other days, and so we build a composite. If you want, I went out there right now, 3 in the morning. Some of these trains you'd find on there, some trains you might not find on today, but you might find them tomorrow. So it's a composite of layers of trains. In fact, some cases it builds the worst case. What if everything showed up on the same day? Question?
I don't know if I missed this, but how much of this is controlled by computers and how much is controlled by people, and how many people?
Most of the dispatching is done as called CAD, which is computer-assisted dispatching. They, in fact, will take some of this and it responds to a certain program, and it already knows that my number 8 train gets priority over my number 7 train, and so it will do some of that. It's easy when you're out on the main line. It gets much more difficult in the yard. It's in the yard area, and this terminal area is where human intervention has to take place. The computer, there's so many things coming at it, it has a difficult time sorting things out. What we would like to do is, and the railroads like to do, is you could take a train coming out of Eugene, and let's say it's going to Eastern Oregon, that the computer would plot its route through the whole thing. Nobody would have to touch it. But unfortunately, you'll have this thing like the switch engine coming out on the main line. Boom, it's dead. Now what do I do? So they use it. The dispatcher with the computer controls hundreds of miles of track, one person. So without it, it would be it'd really be busy.
The high-speed Amtrak trains, the Talgo trains, which I guess are rated to go 79 miles an hour on certain stretches, how much does that mess up the system?
Oh, good question, because here's a passenger train example coming through.
That was at 3 in the morning, so you can't blame passenger trains for anything.
Yeah.
That's all the railroads stumbling over themselves.
Yeah, this next one is just an example of, now, white trains are passenger trains, so you've got a train coming across the bridge there, and you've got a train coming down from Tacoma. And what you see here is you'll see trains delayed. Here's a train that's off on a siding now to let this passenger train go by. Another train is actually facing it here, and I can't recall how they cleared that, but yeah. Oh, that's right. They got to cross over there.
Went from one track in front of the other one and down the other.
And so as they approach each other, you'll see this train now gets to come. Oh, okay. There's the crossover, but that train's still delayed. Now you'll see now this track is cleared all the way, almost all the way to Portland, and this is actually great dispatching, because what this has allowed them to do is okay, I got to empty the track anyway, so I'm doing something with the trains. Later on, well, you'll see other. Well, actually, this one cleared pretty quickly. This one actually did clear quickly. So, but that's an idea of what happens when the passenger trains come through the system. Everybody's got to get out of their way and give them
It's the
priority.
overtaking issue, which is what is this like, and you have no place to pass.
Oh.
So, but what dispatchers will also do, they'll take an Amtrak train, and once they open that hole for it, all of a sudden they may slip a couple other trains right behind it. So if you hang around the station long enough, after, if you're meeting somebody at the Salem station, as an example, wait around for a bit. There's probably going to be a couple of freight trains coming through, because they were delayed, waiting for it, or they're following one through because they cleared a path.
One of the things that the person that built this model and ran it for us pointed out on this particular slide, here's this train. It's already clear up almost to Tacoma. And it creates a kind of a wake, because here are 3 trains that weren't significantly delayed initially, but just like on the highway, now one of them had to slow down for some reason, and they're all backed up behind them. So that was an interesting thing. So summary of the base case. This is the first case we ran. Significant congestion already. Ed already knew that. Okay. Actually, less impact on passenger trains. Narrow corridors were an issue, large number of yard trains. Here's some numbers around it.
Should point out that when you run that model, it's fascinating because you can just watch it like a giant train set with these trains moving around. And when they stop, the computer starts clocking how long it waits there. So what you end up with is not only doing the speed as it moves through the system, but it also will take how many minutes has been moving and how many minutes is delayed. So you get a printout, not just a color map, but you actually get a printout so you can do some analysis.
So here's sort of a summary. You've got freight trains, average speed 12.3 miles an hour. Not quite as bad as it sounds, because remember there's switchers in here too. They're stopping and starting all the time. Passenger trains, 42.3 miles an hour average through the system. That's not bad for an urban area. However, hours of delay, you had 402 hours of delay. Passenger
in
96 hours.
Yeah.
So in terms of all there were roughly 350 trains in there, so more than an hour per train delay. And then this delay ratio is the ratio of the time trains were stopped when they should have been moving versus the time they were actually moving. That was 18% of the time. And that allows some comparisons a little later. Here's a comparison with Chicago. Now, Portland had, this run 555 trains. Portland had almost Chicago had almost 4 times that many trains. Chicago has immensely number more passenger trains. The speeds of these are freight speeds, were roughly the same, and the hours were really horrific. Portland had, even though they had about a quarter of the number of trains, had half of the hours of delay that Chicago had. And then when you look at that delay ratio, Portland was almost as bad as Chicago. So.
Is that passenger trains for Chicago, including commuter rail?
Right.
Yeah.
In the Chicago network.
Right.
Again, a much larger network at just downtown Chicago.
But what this is showing is Portland area is moving much fewer trains, but they're experiencing similar delays. Now, in this model, one thing that became apparent was when you ran this, there were no big immediate solutions. There was nothing you could go out there and say, this is the silver bullet that's going to solve the problem.
Should point out that on the model, again, why it costs so much money, is when you go through this, it'll dispatch it. Now, some of it, if there's a little conflict, it'll make the change immediately. And you want to, let's say, if we could clear this one train, if it went 5 minutes earlier, we wouldn't have this problem. Well, the dispatcher, the computer will make that change. Saying a rational person would do that too. We run into problems. What we then end up doing is we build a fix. We need to go from this track to this track. So in the computer, we put it in there. And we go back and say, well, how can we solve this? This is where people with some railroad knowledge get in there and say, well, what if we do this? We change this guy. We make these decisions, and we put the new network in, and then we push the enter button, and about an hour and a half later, it spews all this stuff out and says, well, it worked here, it didn't work here. Okay, well, let's go back and try it again.
So here's some of the incremental solutions that they came up with. That was the list of them. Never mind. You can't tell from that. One of them was, interesting, Vancouver Yard. Remember that train that was coming off that Fallbridge subdivision? Turns out that if you could go around the back side of the yard to get over there to Fallbridge, you could save a lot of congestion. In fact, this is, I believe it's under construction now, isn't it?
And they're in the EIS with a 2005 build date, completed in 2007.
Yeah, so this one's well on its way.
What happens is traffic coming from the north, wanting to go east on the Burlington Northern. Currently, it comes through the rail yard, and it blocks all activity at the south end of the yard. Yeah. And it also cuts off activity at the north end of the yard. So Vancouver Yard basically comes to a halt. And then once it's moving, then activity can resume. That all builds up into those hours of delay.
And it was interesting. The freight railroads have this thing where if you want to run another passenger train, they will very often say, hey, I'll tell you what, if you'll make this capital improvement to improve my operations, I'll let you run another passenger train because it'll make up for my having to delay. Well, this was the fix that Burlington Northern wanted as a condition of adding 2 more passenger trains that would come through this market. So that was kind of their first priority in a way. A couple other things. The bridges themselves were fine, but some of the approaches were slow, and by getting trains across the bridges faster, you could unclog the system. Number 3, fixing that junction that we kept talking about, the North Portland Junction. Another one, there's some issues in the yards here where trains don't have enough room to store the train in the yard. If you're assembling a train, if you're assembling a 5,000-foot train, you've only got 3,000 feet of track in your yard. You got to put it together, pull out. You put one side together, put the other side together, pull out on the main line, push back, connect, and then pull out. So this would improve some of that kind of movement. Double tracking some of this area on the Kenton branch, creating a fixing an intersection here that just slows everything down. A couple of other speed items down toward Canby. And then right now, if you watch trains, I didn't know this before this study, but if you go down to Albina Yard and you watch trains come through, this is supposed to be the main line of UP, and yet some of those trains have to wind through the yard to get there. So fixing that situation would...
This particular project is in preliminary engineering right now, with final engineering due January, and construction will start fairly soon to have it. The governor said he did want it done by December of '04. He said, "You will cut the ribbon, won't you?" And they all said, "Yes, we'll have it done."
Oh, okay, good.
It's about a $6.7 million project.
Okay. And then there were some needs for sidings on the Graham branch, too. So, now, when you made all those improvements and we ran the model, well, freight speeds didn't go up that much, but that wasn't what we were looking for. Hours of delay dropped almost in half. So that was significant. And the delay ratio went down to a ratio that's much more acceptable, around 10%.
See, the railroads will accept a certain amount of delay. It's like if you're in a situation like on the highway at peak hour, and we have level of service A, which is what you'd expect out there by Boardman someplace, and you say, well, that's what I need on the Sunset at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, you'll never achieve it. You're going to achieve something else, or if you do achieve it, it means you've invested an enormous amount of money to take care of the problem, if you could take care of the problem. So zero delay, that just does not happen. You've overbuilt your system, or you don't have enough traffic on your system. You've lost almost all your business, so then everything will be fine. There's nothing that driving away the business won't handle if you want to lower some of these delays.
Yeah. You got a question?
But so all those numbers are for 2001 traffic if you did all those improvements immediately.
Right.
So it doesn't take into account increased traffic
Right.
on the system.
All right. Let's look at the next. Great question. No, no, you're exactly right. In fact, this is where we really ran into some really interesting problems. We did some projections.
The growth was the hardest part. This is where the railroads were all sitting there and saying, well, I'm going to project, I'm going to do this, and they weren't going to tell you. And you listen to the Port of Portland and Port of Seattle, we're going to grow business by 11% per year, and you look at all this stuff and you say, holy smokes, it's going to be out. We're going to just congeal in about 5 years. Then you go back and say, but historically, between 1990 and this is what you did. Well, yes, but that's different. So they're always planning for a higher amount, and plus, as you look at some of these, this is between the two railroads. So is the Union Pacific really going to grab a train that was on a Burlington Northern and call it, it's in my camp, what is the growth? It's zero growth, but it grew on their side. So that's where you have the two companies kind of guarding their long-range business plan. Their long-range planning, I should point out, is a 5-year plan. They don't think like public does 20 years. They just don't do that.
But I have to say on their behalf, markets come and go very quickly for them. So what they did agree on, this was interesting. We could never get agreement initially on these numbers, but they did agree that, okay, 3.25% per year. Now, and I believe that the relative distribution is about right between those kind of trains, which has something significant here. Remember we said there's priorities among freight trains. Well, the intermodal, and especially the intermodal priority, are the highest priority. They're the ones that are growing, and the auto trains, whereas some of the others are manifest are not growing as fast. We said, when we did the study, we talked about the results as being 10-year results rather than nailing it down and saying 2011. The reason for that was you can make your own assumptions about whether you're going to grow at 2% or 2.25 or 4%. But the same things are going to happen. It's just whether they happen faster or more slowly in the system. So by saying 10 years, you can say, okay, if you think it's 12 years, okay, 12 years. If you think it's 5 years, okay, 5 years. But here's what's going to happen.
To give you an example, when I first took the rail planning job, the total amount of traffic in the state of Oregon rail was about 34 million tons. It's now 65, almost 66 million tons. So it's significantly increased. And if you watch that graph, it wasn't just a straight line. It would go up and down, but the overall result is it went up. In some cases, it grew much faster. In other cases, it plateaued. So that's why we did not want to use it, a date, well, by 2010, whatever, because it skews what's going on.
Okay, and this slide is in here because when I showed that last slide to some people a while back, they said, so what's a manifest train? What's an intermodal train? Well, here's a manifest train. Those are just regular old box cars. Stack them up. Here's an intermodal, two intermodal trains. There's this one and this one. That basically to the railroad, intermodal means containers or trailers on flatbeds. And then here is when they talk about unit grain trains. Here's a unit grain train coming down the gorge. Passenger train forecast. We assumed that in 10 years there would be 18 rather than 10 crossings per day in terms of the number of trains going up and down there. And then at full build-out, which we could test, there would be 26 trains a day. That's from the Oregon-Washington high-speed rail corridor study. Interesting on the passenger trains, remember we talked about going clear up to Tacoma in the study. There are actually some improvements that Burlington Northern has requested as a condition of going above the 2 more trains that Vancouver Yard will accommodate. So there are some other improvements besides those incremental ones that you need to run these passenger trains. But still, we loaded them in the system. And I'm going to run this again, but I'm not going to try and talk about various moves. All I'm going to point out is, if you look at this, how many, not so much that one yet, but you'll start to see a whole lot of white arrows in here. And all of them sort of aim toward that bridge. And this is a situation that took, I forgot to start counting at the beginning, but as I recall, about 5 hours to clear before these trains cleared through the system. So you were right back, even though you could move faster through these switches, and you could pass on the Kenton line, and you could bypass Vancouver Yard, that capacity within 10 years was used up in terms of the additional numbers of trains. So we'll just run that. Now, why was this here? Oh, okay. The key problem in terms of using up that capacity, that's really the bottom line of what came out of the whole study. The green shaded area here is where those Burlington Northern trains want to go, predominantly. The red lines are where the Union Pacific trains want to go predominantly. And when you put them together, you have what we call the X. In other words, the highest volume traffic areas on those lines keep wanting to cross in front of each other. So one of the conclusions of the study was, what do we do to untie the X? So we'll see that in a minute. But here's just some base comparisons. We had 402 hours of delay. We dropped it to 226, went back up to 500. We added the other traffic. Here were some really interesting results. We ran some sensitivity tests. We wanted to find out how much interference are the passenger trains creating in the system.
Because the railroads always say all the capacity problems are due to the passengers. If we just had them out of there, everything would be fine and wonderful. So that's exactly what we did.
We did. We took them out. Well, first we said, well, we're going to take, what was that first one? We took out, kept all the passenger trains, took out a bunch of freight trains. This started out with 638 freight trains here. So we took a bunch of freight trains out. We saved some time. Well, that's good. Not a lot, but it was good. Then we said, okay, we're going to put no new passenger trains in. So that basically cuts it from 65 to 36 passenger trains. And we're going to cut some freight trains. And we got a 17% improvement. And then we said, well, let's do one more. Let's not cut any passenger trains. And what did we do with the freight train?
Add all the freight.
Oh, put all the freight. Oh, yeah, we cut out all the passenger trains. We said only existing passenger trains. So we cut that from 65 down to 36, but we put all the freight back in. And guess what? The delay was right up to the same amount of delay there was with the passenger trains on there. this is a little bit maybe unique to this particular area, but what was happening was, as a matter of fact, there was room in the various switching areas and sidings due to the incremental improvements that you could actually accommodate and handle the freight when a passenger train came through. So there was a way to create a window for that passenger train. So it was more like the freight was interfering with the passenger than vice versa. So back to our conclusions. Is capacity sufficient? No. How about for the Port of Portland and Port of Vancouver? No. Will there be enough capacity to increase intercity rail? No. Further,
our modeler was interested. He's done a lot of these, and he couldn't figure out how the system worked today. He said, by all means, if I came into this thing just completely clean, and I didn't know what it is, that this thing should not be functioning. I mean, even at the level, but also the model, because it took away the my engines, your engines type of thing, actually made it look better than it really is.
So our modeler said, well, you got capacity for either half the expected growth, or you can put up with 25% delays. So you take your choice. Okay, the rail system's saturated. We all knew that. Improvements, interestingly. Overall improvements, like we said, there are some medium-term, relatively inexpensive. All of those 10 improvements we saw up there were $132 million, and of those, $40 million was just the Vancouver Yard. So there were actually some pretty reasonable improvements. Long-term, there are some major improvements required, and the biggest one is to get rid of that X, which is probably, we did for those guys two designs. One of them was a cross-under and one was a flyover, and they ranged, depending on if you took the low environmental impact, or high environmental impact but low cost, $20 million. If you took the low environmental impact but higher cost, it was $70 million. So somewhere in between there is what it would cost in terms of the capital cost of untying that X through, as you were talking about, either a flyover or lowering, or adjusting the system so you could go underneath the main line.
But when we talk about relatively low cost, only $110 million, for this one, you have to put it in comparison that a new interstate highway bridge is going to be around $400 to $500 million, just for the bridge.
So,
not including, and this takes care of things up and downstream. That does not include, in the case of the highway, taking care of the Coliseum problem where it goes down to 4 lanes, or State Highway 14 and those things.
yeah.
When you're asking for money for these projects, who are you asking? Public or private sources?
Yes.
Well, that's the nice thing about being the consultant. We don't have to ask.
That's my job. Some of these, the other part that we're doing by the modeling is we can, we get in more detail. We can continue who benefits and to what degree. The Vancouver Yard bypass. Some of those, you can attribute some of those improvements to the passenger train, let's say, just for argument's sake, 20% of the improvements. And the freight railroad, because they got that problem right now, as you saw, even without growing the passenger train, they get the rest of it. Well, you go in there, and it doesn't always work that way. And sometimes you end up with a 50-50 split. Sometimes you just gulp and say, I need the passenger train, and I'll put it on. Give you an example, we just did an improvement in southeast Portland. Total was $14.2 million, and our negotiated settlement was we pay 8.1, the Union Pacific paid 6 point, whatever it was, 1 or 2. We have another project we've got down in Eugene, which is about a $4 million project, and it really has more benefits to the passenger service than the freight service. We've just started those negotiations. They're always a lot of fun because we have virtually no cards, and so it's playing poker with someone you know is the world champion, and you don't even know how to play the game. So we're down there, maybe you may end up paying 80% of it. It's hard to say. So, but it is a public-private type of venture. The other one, you can sit back and you can say, well, hey, as we showed here, in 10 years, you guys are going to have the problem. You resolve the problem. It's your money. But if you're the Union Pacific Railroad, they operate in 23 states, and they only have so much for capital. And they've got these problems all over their system. So they're going to look at it, and they're going to rank it a little different than we do. They're going to look at it and say, okay, what's the benefit cost? I mean, if I make this improvement here, if I spend $1 million here, will I get $1 million that'll return to my bottom line? Or am I only going to get, 500,000? Now, we can come in with public money and say, we're going to do this improvement, and all of a sudden, that $500,000 makes sense to them because the improvement to them is worth more than $1 million. So, and this occurs, I mean, it's one of those interesting, they never prepare you to do this at Portland State or any other place. How to negotiate with the robber barons at the railroad companies.
Well, there's an interesting difference. There's an interesting difference in perspective too, though. That it's probably not just railroads, but it's any private sector operator of infrastructure. In that the railroads are looking at a payback of 5 years. In other words, if Union Pacific looks at its whole system and where they're going to invest their capital, they can see places where they're going to get repaid in 5 years. And when they do their internal rate of return calculation, they're looking for 20%. The state and the public, rightfully, because they're looking at different purposes to the public infrastructure, tends to look 20 years out in terms of payback and tends to look at rates of return sufficient to cover your capital cost, which is interest-free or tax-free bonds. So they're looking at 5%, 20 years. Railroad is looking at, logically, 20%, 5 years. So when you go in to negotiate with them, they're saying, oh, yeah, it's a good project. Yeah, it helps us. That's not where we'd put our money. So it's just quite a different perspective.
Well, one of the statements made by the Union Pacific when we came up with all of those hours of delay, because we actually broke it out between the two railroads, the fellow from Union Pacific said, that amount of delay right now, what costs us is not enough to drive any of those projects into our capital list for the next 5 years. They've got other problems in other places that are going to use for capital. Now, to look at the grand scope of things, this is the problem that the railroads are facing in the United States, is the inability to attract capital. Well, we're out there spending gazillions on highways. They have to raise it internally. When we build new airports and all of a sudden with public dollars, they have to raise it internally. And so as business increases and they have the ability to go out and capture more business, they're constrained with these kinds of capacity problems. I mean, what was a system 20 years ago that carried 35 million, 34 million tons of freight, today is virtually the same thing. They're moving 65 million tons of freight, and they're going to be moving 80 million or 100 million. It isn't going to work. And so this is one of the very, really basic public policy debates that are going on right now, is how do you provide capital to a private industry? First, how do you justify that to the taxpayer? And that's a wise investment. And how do you secure that amount of money such as collateral? And I just got back from a meeting with all my fellow rail people from other states with the railroads, and it is probably the #1 economic problem facing the railroads in the United States, both the little railroads and the bigger railroads. If a little railroad that goes down here to Willamina, it derails a train, they clean it up themselves. If the highway washes out, all our trucks, orange trucks, the MoDOT come in and take care of it. And they pay 100% of it, and the trucking company just, they get some delay, but they do pay for it out of their fuel tax. So this is one of the great dilemmas. And also, they also will talk about, hey, I pay taxes on my infrastructure. Railroads do. And the other part that kind of galls them, and some of them get in politics and get carried away on it, but the other part that galls them is that we did a study internally, and we found out that about 27% of the total dollars spent on local streets in the state of Oregon come from non-highway sources, bonding, property taxes. And guess who pays property taxes? The railroad. And guess who gets to pay some of the bonds? The railroads. And guess who gets to use the improvements? Not the railroads. So, I mean, that's the public policy debate.
Interesting. Yeah.
How much work do you guys do, like, in terms of like the engineering from Washington and Oregon, in terms of the dollars that come into for these improvements? How how does that work together? Like even with the modeling, paying for the modeling, Washington State do they help pay for some of this costs for this program for improvements to the rail lines?
Well, back up. The study and the modeling were part of the Interstate 5 Transportation and Trade Task Force group, which was a bi-state study with a bi-state committee overseeing it. This study was, correct me if I'm wrong, but was predominantly federal funds that were used to make that particular study. So that's the study itself. But then, as we've been talking about, when you get into the actual capital improvements, they're all negotiated. Unlike the highways where the public owns that piece of infrastructure and the public, through various sometimes smooth and sometimes difficult means decides what it's going to do with it. In the case of the railroads, because they're privately owned, if there's a public benefit to improving them, then it has to be negotiated out with the railroads. So.
But I think what complicates the Portland-Seattle passenger corridor is the fact that about 8 miles of it is in Oregon. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, I'm not really concerned with the passenger train that runs from Portland to Seattle. I'm more concerned that runs from Portland to Eugene. But obviously, the linkages between the two are very important to us. About 70% of our passengers in the Willamette Valley either start their trip or end their trip north of the border. And so if that gets chopped off, I lose my passengers, and if we get chopped off, they lose their passengers. So how do you fund those? That's an interesting discussion. I did an improvement, or I'd say the Oregon did an improvement to improve the signaling between Portland and Vancouver, Washington, in conjunction with the Burlington Northern Railroad. And basically, we kind of paid up to the point where it was a state line. Now that junction, the critical one there, doesn't impact Portland UG trains at all, but it impacts the Seattle-Portland trains, and that's one of the limits. How do we pay for that? How does Washington bring money down here? How do we trade this off? And Washington has constitutional limitations on how they spend money that are different than what we have. So, and then you got the freight railroads that are sitting there. I mean, to them there is no border. And you're trying to say, well, we're negotiating not only railroad to railroad and public to public, but we've got public. The public isn't just a public. It's two states.
So anyway, a couple of other things. Develop routes to bypass Portland, separate, undo the X. The other thing that's interesting here is that this study recommended considering in the future a way to bypass the entire BNSF main line north of the bridge as a way to significantly improve things. That is an expensive project. What happens if rail doesn't increase? Well, shipping costs and reliability decrease, which hurts Portland's role as a transportation hub. Rail shippers may be forced to divert traffic, change modes, or relocate. That's very significant because in the days of just-in-time delivery, or when the Port of Portland schedules it's got a ship that's calling that wants to be there a minimum number of days for its own economics, and it can't rely on the rail system to get the products there, then you've got a serious problem. And what happens more often than not, people worry about the shift from rail to truck. There's a long-term trend there, but the businesses that rely on rail will tend, if faced with that situation, to relocate. So you don't just, it's not you just got trucks instead of railroads. You may see the entire business leave the area. So that does become a significant economic issue.
That's the economics talk.
And I believe our company didn't do it, so I don't know how good it would be. But I believe there's a study of that on the website as well. Other questions that we ran into: what is the cost of delay? We didn't attempt to assign values to these delay figures. Would joint dispatching better deal with congestion? In other words, we got two different dispatching centers deciding where those trains go, depending on which track they're on. Well, wouldn't it be better to have one dispatching center?
Or at least put them in the same room so they talk to each other.
But that switch engine did go out there by the model, not by the guy doing it anyway. understand. Anyway, and then, obviously, how would it affect truck volumes? There's actually less trade-off between rail and truck than most people realize, but still, with intermodal freight and the ability to move trains efficiently, there is some, and we should get a better handle on that. This last one is a separate issue. Right, it has to do with the river channel.
That last one is almost a tail wagging the dog, because this whole thing about replacing the bridge was an outgrowth of people in Vancouver. I mean, this is how the way this path weaves around.
The way public policy works.
Okay, that public policy works. People in Vancouver, Washington were upset because the highway bridge would raise up and interrupt the I-5. And if you notice on the highway bridge, there's a hump kind of towards on the south end of the bridge. Way before your time, probably, that hump wasn't there. And when we built the second bridge across the river in the 1950s, we ended up putting the hump in there and taking the other one hump. So, because every barge, I mean, a sailboat, up goes the bridge. You got 10,000 motorists all waiting for, this much of the mast to go through the bridge. And so we put the hump over there to take care of most of that. And it did a great job. The other part is, though, when the river is really running, the tugboats come down, go through that hump. It's on the south side of the river. The railroad span downstream is on the north side of the river. And so the barges end up going in, being driven by the current as they fight across the other side of the river. And so the barge operators said, we've got to move that span from the opening from the north side of the river to the south side so they line up.
Where are the openings here, Ed?
This one is on the south. Oh, this one is on the north end.
Right. So they come under the I-5 bridge here.
It shows up any place.
No, it shows up in the audience, and then they have to move over in the middle of the channel. Oh. This is actually east.
Okay.
But anyway, so the opening here is on the I-5 bridge, but the opening on the BNSF bridge is over here. So they go down there, and this is in high waters. I mean, so the water's moving really fast, and the barge has to make a maneuver to get through the other bridge. Well, that was the issue that actually got the I-5 Trade Committee concerned about that bridge, which then opened up the entire issue of, well, what is the capacity of that bridge? And hence, we learned a whole bunch of things that nobody thought to ask before this thing came up.
If we're going to replace the bridge span, should we replace it with a 3-track bridge or a 4-track bridge? And everybody doing it. Well, we need to increase the track numbers. And so every time you did that, the price went up. And the railroads went, well, hold it. We don't benefit from this at all. And yet we get...
What do you... On the...
What we end up getting is they end up getting paid, they have to pay 5% of the project.
What are we supposed to do?
Computer back?
No.
Yeah. Oh, up there. Okay. I'll learn this. Okay. Oh, we got it just to the right slide. Okay. And we'll move that picture back again. So anyway, that
kind of point out where are we on the whole trade corridor study. I think right now we did the highway piece of it, and we've done the rail piece of it, and now we had this huge committee of blue ribbon committee, and we met I don't know how many times, and for the highway thing, obviously that got most of their interest because they drive on that, and the railroad got some of their interest. We have a different issues on how we do projects on railroads than we do on highways. We don't have a long involved environmental process because the railroads being federally chartered are exempt from some things that ODOT, as a local agency, the city of Portland has to do. If we're improving an existing physical plant, we virtually have no environmental impact that we have to sign. We have to take care of stormwater drainage and all that other kind of stuff. But by and large, you can go ahead and make those improvements without going through this long, drawn-out process. And it takes a highway project, or sometimes if it's on a fast track, it could take up to 9 years, something like that, Gail. It deals with our Region 1 office, and you can start out with an improvement, and this is an idea until you cut the ribbon can be 8 or 9 years. With the one we're doing with the Union Pacific, we're going to sign the agreement in a month or a month and a half, and we'll have it done by December of '04. And that just blows most of the highway people away, because how do you do that? So it's just a different world here. And plus, it's the private sector. The private sector wants to make sure that they don't get burdened with going through all this huge number of hearings, and and because it's their business any more than Safeway wants to go to the public to find out they want to change the color of their building.
Interesting. Any other questions? Yeah.
This question has to do with like public access to the east side of the Willamette River along the central east side. And I've heard different things about in the long term about bringing down I-5 and whether the railroad is in the right place. And related issue is that there's some curve as you get close to the steel bridge, I think, that tends to delay all the trains on the West Coast like a lot. So I heard that there was some interest in the railroad that they'd want to put the line underground or do something to it to solve that issue, which could help improve public access to waterfront as well. Do you know anything about that issue? Or
As part of the Rose Garden, or whatever you want to call it, master plan, on the north end of the steel bridge where the grain elevator is, there's a very sharp curve. And one of the plans, planners love to use El Marcos because they don't cost money to draw a straight line. But to build that straight line costs a lot of money. And so what they're going to do, what the plan was, to straighten that curve out. We have what we call 15-degree curves, one going to the left and one going to the right. So trains very slow cross there. It's like the Twilliger curves. How do you get rid of it without spending a lot of money? And so, but this is to punch it on through. Then it would then make that property, which was a rail property down along the river, the rail won't be there anymore. All I got to do is let Mr. Dreyfus, who has more money than Mr. Allen does, to go move his grain elevator someplace.
So it's a big. I will say on the curve on that bridge, that was one of the incremental improvements that was put into the model. That, given all the other things that were going on in the system, turns out to not make all that much difference, because you do have to slow down to go around that one set of curves there. But you've already slowed down in the system for a whole bunch of reasons, and so that turned out not to be a high priority, especially considering the cost. Yeah.
I couldn't see from your earlier drawings which tracks head south. What are the main tracks that go south? And if one of them is the one that goes through the east side industrial district, is there any issues of that? Since you didn't really talk a lot about it, is that slowing down traffic because it's got to go through neighborhood streets virtually?
Let's see if I can
I think you
find
have
this.
a picture of that.
I do, if I'm just trying to.
It's interesting. We're about to sign with the Union Pacific the second part of the getting rid of that problem in Southeast Portland. The first part we already concluded, and that was taking care of everything from the steel bridge out past the golf course and out towards Tacoma Street. The next one is the one goes into Albina Yard, and that one is because we get trains that are stuck in the yard and can't get out, and so they back up through Southeast Portland. So we're going to put a bypass yard track around the yard, much like they did in Vancouver, in order to get traffic through there. Now we speeded up the trains from basically 10 miles an hour to 35 miles an hour through Southeast Portland, and we now go 70 miles an hour past the golf course out there at Tacoma Street. When we speeded up traffic, people said, that's dangerous, you're going too fast. And yet if you figure if you're a motorist waiting at that crossing, how much faster the train is going to go by you at 35 miles an hour versus 10 miles an hour. So, in fact, the slower the trains are, the more people have a tendency to say, I have plenty of time. The train can stop. No, it can't. We have lots of accidents at grade crossings that are 10-mile-an-hour trains, just for that, because people think I can beat the train around the crossing because it's going slow.
If I could just follow up real quick.
Sure.
Most people drive about 70 miles an hour down McLaughlin and down there anyways in the Brooklyn area, so not a problem. But related
That's another issue.
Related to the east side, again, though, since the railroad only plans 5 years ahead, they probably don't ever consider about the interstate being gone and that railroad being in the way of people, redevelopment that may occur in the east side industrial area being between those people and the river. So is this not even on the railroad's agenda, burying or removing that rail line?
I don't think it's on the railroad. It may not be on the railroad agenda, but I don't think it's on the public's agenda. All they look at is moving I-5, forgetting a railroad down below. I mean, how do you?
And forgetting one of the busiest warehousing districts on the West Coast. And we're just going to move the freeway and put it right on top of that. Well, that's the whole point of freight planning. You know, you'll hear a lot of planning now about freight planning. Well, one of the things the public tends to do is we get all interested in the freeways because that's what we see, you know? Okay. Well, I'm not saying move I-5 or don't move I-5, but you have to recognize that if you move it where a lot of the plans talked about moving it, you're wiping out a whole bunch of warehouses that are very significant to the Portland transportation hub. So, yeah, all those things get mixed.
But they kind of, again, I think part of that is the planners, well, was using Now Markham, and we moved the railroad. You know, where? Where are you going to move it? And I know people forget about that. That's the main north-south route. We run 20 to 30 trains a day on it. We run 6 Amtrak trains. We're going to be up to 12 Amtrak trains, and there's no shortcut to get around it. I can't just go the other side of the river and sneak down. I can see trying to build a new rail line through Lake Oswego. That's a planning job for somebody else, not me. So.
All right. Yeah,
well, the question is kind of silly, but the aesthetics of railroads and warehouse districts and things like that, you know, that seems like the major problem a lot of people see without seeing the bigger picture. Is there anything the state is doing to try to, I don't know, just promote their side of it, that we need this for industry and everything? And then, you know, the public, they'll say, well, that's an ugly thing in front of the Rose Garden, or, you know, what plans or models do you use to combat that?
Well, I think we're probably more active in it than we were a number of years ago. That once we started doing the centralized planning in ODOT with the transportation plan, which Gail's working on, and other things, we now have a role in how to comment on local plans. And so we will, I get a lot of them. Sometimes people forget, don't give it to us. But if there's an opportunity to comment on a comprehensive plan or even a local development plan, some of our regional planners are smart enough, they'll send it to us and say, what do you think about this? We'll comment on it. The case is it's going to cut off freight access. Or the other one, the most common one is, where's the cheapest land now in an urban area? It's up against the railroad tracks. As soon as you build a condo up next to the railroad tracks, what's the first thing you do? Those damn train horns. So then they come to us. And so when the development goes out, we're going to say, you have to understand the railroad's not going away. It causes noise and vibration. And we recommend that in the development scheme, that the developer note that in there so they don't come back and say, well, I never knew. Out in Banks, this is exactly what happened. Condo houses up against the railroad track. Guy told them the railroad was going away. No, they do the switching at 2 o'clock in the morning. They sued and won a $1.5 million judgment against the developer. That perked up a lot of ears.
I would say also, though, that ODOT has a very active freight committee that was, I think it started about 5 years ago, as I recall. And they're actually they're starting to do some things to raise those kinds of issues in the public's eyes. So, and again, I say it's not a question of whether you do the thing or don't do the thing. It's recognizing what the impacts are and what you have to be concerned about. So, great question. Thanks.
Saying is freight doesn't vote.
Ah, well.
We've reached our 1:30 end of our seminar, unfortunately. If anyone has additional questions, I'm sure you can ask directly afterwards. And I want to thank you very much for a very informative
You're welcome.
day.
And we'll send all the diagrams and the numbers to your professors so they can quiz you on it Monday.
And those of you who are enrolled, make sure you checked in. Some of you who asked for questions verbally, I was able to mark you down, but I may not have gotten all of you.
I got to figure out how to get that off the screen. And she told me about it. Gail's the one that told me about it, trying to track this thing down.